Starfield doesn't have any truly villainous villains, and it doesn't really have any especially heroic heroes either. Instead, most every faction and character comes in a shade of lunar grey. So what does it actually mean to be good or bad in a game with such a peculiar scale of morality then? And who or what is the greatest evil in this galaxy? You could certainly argue that Starfield's real villain is the loading screens, but I think it's probably more complicated than that. When playing Starfield, you'll find yourself taking part in plenty of shootouts with generic and disorganized pirates, spacers, and unholy creatures. But in a story that is more of a race to the finish line than it is a battle against a great galactic evil, we're left with constantly shifting and indistinct forms of antagonist. There is, of course, an obvious answer to the question of who is the bad guy, which I'll get back to later, but there's also a lot more nuance to the moral frameworks of the settled system's many factions than most of the game's critics are willing to acknowledge. And the fact that all of these groups are at least a little bit bad and a little bit good has a huge impact on how it actually feels to exist in this world. The galaxy that Bethesda built here remains remarkably tonally consistent across Wild West frontiers, cyberpunk cities, and Starfleet academies precisely because these factions are all rooted in an ethically grey baseline. There is plenty of hope in Starfield, but there's also a heck of a lot of despair.
The artifact. If you could place it on the table here.
That's it.
If there's one faction in Starfield that we could reasonably argue isn't evil in any tangible way, it would have to be Constellation. As the one group the player is duty-bound to get along with in order to finish the main quest, you'd think they would have been presented as more of a moral blank, allowing the player to carve out their own path. But on the whole, Constellation and its members are probably the closest thing to goody two-shoes Boy Scouts in the game. Though there is obviously some nuance to their opinions, all of the Constellation companions that you can bring along on your adventures are going to stick pretty steadfastly to their virtuous code of ethics. Constellation basically act as your moral compass throughout the game, reminding you what's right and what's wrong, even when your options don't actually align with good and bad. Your companions often seem to think that you made a questionable choice no matter what you end up choosing. And while that can be a bit frustrating, it does make several of the game's decisions feel more interesting when you know they can't be satisfied. Either way, I don't think Constellation are really as perfect as they claim to be, since they still have some very questionable morals. For one thing, it seems dangerous and a bit selfish that after discovering parallel universes and space magic, they insist on keeping the details entirely to themselves. And on the whole, the group is more focused on finding the artifacts no matter the cost, sort of like a certain other group, rather than actually specifically trying to make the galaxy a better place. Beyond Constellation, the United Colonies, on their surface, represent the platonic ideal of a futuristic sci-fi civilization. They're the polished, structured, Star Trek-esque society that purports to be unequivocally righteous and wonderful. Wander the streets of New Atlantis and you'll marvel at the clean paths and friendly faces. Visit a local restaurant and you can indulge in the finest cuisine in the Milky Way. Take a walk through the Vanguard Museum and they'll tell you just how much better they are than all the other factions with their Starship Troopers styled propaganda. It all seems incredibly utopian until you start to dig just a little beneath the surface, and suddenly the United Colonies doesn't seem so great. For a start, you might take a trip beneath the streets of New Atlantis to the Well, where people are stuck living in far less utopian conditions. And that is especially baffling when there is a whole empty planet outside the city borders that the United Colonies could be building affordable housing on. And you'll find some equally inhospitable conditions in Cydonia and other United Colonies settlements. When you take into account the worrying reach of the United Colonies' military hegemony, the insular bureaucratic structure of their society, and when you dig more into the faction's role in the various skirmishes throughout the history of the settled systems and the character of their dodgy leaders, it becomes very clear that their hands are not clean. As I've said before, I think the Terramorphs are quite a compelling threat in Starfield. But the only reason they are is because the United Colonies messed up by letting their population grow and become interplanetary. So even that potential danger is the United Colonies' fault. Basically then, they're not super bad in the game, but they're really only one step away from being an evil stratocratic regime. They're not the villains, but they're very close to becoming one. And though it's less obviously true, I think the same can very much be said for the Freestar Collective as well. Though the faction's de facto capital of Aquila City would seem to be representative of a semi-fair and independent, if a little rough around the edges society, it's also really just one end of the Freestar Collective scale. If you make your way to beautiful Neon, you'll encounter the dark, seedy underbelly of this sovereign union of free thinkers. And as lovely as it is to take in the pretty colours and sample the local delicacies, Neon is clearly not a nice place run by benevolent leaders. And the fact that it's even allowed to exist in this form under the auspices of the Freestar Collective while their own rangers are unable to effectively keep the city safe says a lot about the Freestar Collective on the whole. The colonies presided over by this faction and its board might have the freedom to do pretty much whatever they want, but that does mean they have to deal with an awful lot of bad stuff too. You only have to meet the nefarious Ron Hope to understand all the problems with this corner of the settled systems. There is plenty of good to be found in the Freestar Collective, but they are barely keeping a lid on the chaos and allowing plenty of evil to fester in their supposedly civilized civilization. At least a group like the Crimson Fleet, for all of their obviously villainous behaviour, are entirely honest about how they operate. Yes, they're scroungers and pirates. Yes, they are responsible for some really bad stuff, but they also largely keep to themselves and really emphasize community and camaraderie. Their transparency is honestly quite refreshing in this duplicitous galaxy, and though they're definitely more bad than good, I don't think it would be fair to cast them as unambiguous villains under the leadership they have in the game. The Crimson Fleet are basically the exact opposite of the United Colonies in that they wear all of their evils on their sleeve, but are actually quite a nice bunch once you get to know them. And the enigmatic House Varun ultimately come across in much the same way. Their founder is a lunatic who got them into a very unnecessary war, but on planet they're mostly just weirdos who are trying to get by. Obviously, the zealots who roam the settled systems are never friendly, but those cannon fodder maniacs aren't representative of the faction on the whole. After exploring Varun Kai, you'll realize that they are really quite a simple, tragic people who are trapped on a hostile planet, eating and drinking disgusting food and following strange traditions simply because they don't know any better. They definitely don't seem evil on average then, but their obsession with the Great Serpent does mean they could turn into villains very quickly if given the order. So they're obviously not the good guys either. Putting aside House Varun though, there is one more kind of faction that, on the surface, would seem to be the clear villainous force in Starfield.
There are no rules. Whoever gets all the pieces wins. And I've won. Over and over.
The most obvious answer to the question of who is the bad guy in Starfield would be the Starborn, and perhaps more specifically, the Hunter. Obviously, his general disregard for human life and his cold-hearted attitude throughout the bulk of the story comes off as pretty villainous. But at the same time, he's not specifically trying to destroy the galaxy or harm the player. He's just utterly ruthless in his pursuit of the artifacts and the Unity. He's definitely a bad guy then, but he's not the bad guy. And he's not really much worse than any of the other Starborn. The Emissary is a bit friendlier, but they're still plenty ruthless as well, and although the other Starborn aren't super talkative, at least in my experience, I imagine that their motives aren't much better. Either way though, collectively, it's hard to see the Starborn as the bad guys. Firstly, because they're not an organized group with a single ideology, and secondly, because they're all basically just competing for the same prize that the player is in basically the same way. No matter how you play Starfield's main quest, an outside observer would probably still view your behavior when trying to reach the Unity as pretty ruthless. The Starborn may try to kill you for the artifacts, but it's not likely you've been a pacifist on your quest, and it's not like you're not fighting them too. And once the player passes through the Unity and becomes Starborn themselves, there's a good chance that they will only become even more relentless. So if you're going to view the Starborn as the villains, then you have to view most players as villains as well. And maybe that makes sense to you. Certainly, the implications of this central quest making everyone into a bad guy recontextualizes the story in a very interesting way. But personally, I think it's all just a bit more nuanced than that, and it comes down to the player and how they want to play the game. I don't think the Starborn are unequivocally evil, but they're not that great on average either. And that, ultimately, is not dissimilar to the rest of the galaxy. After spending hundreds of hours in Starfield, I still genuinely don't have a clear favourite faction. And while that's a bit of a shame in some ways, I also love that I'm constantly wrestling with how I feel about all of these groups when playing. They're all cool and interesting in some ways, and just absolutely terrible or annoying in other ways. And that makes it equally entertaining to engage with their individual stories throughout a playthrough. If we were to guess at what the future of the settled systems might look like, I honestly think that any of the game's factions could become the bad guy in some form, if they ended up taking the wrong turn at some point down the line. Starfield's world can be strikingly bleak at times, but there's always a glimpse of hope or humanity around the corner. The game's stories and its many factions rarely ask the player to choose between good or evil. Instead, Starfield often invites us to explore our humanity more deeply, and wonder how our morals might flex to the unimaginable vastness of space and the unknowable mysteries of the universe. But who do you think is the worst of the worst in Starfield? Let me know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk more games. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.